But here's the part of the story that almost everyone gets wrong. China's goal was never to become the world's factory. That was just the first chapter. The real goal was something much bigger. It was to become the world's owner. You see, in the beginning, China was mostly making products for other people's companies. An American company designed the product. A European company owned the brand. A Japanese company supplied the technology. And China simply assembled it. And China's leaders understood something very important. The biggest profits weren't being made on the factory floor. They were being made by the people who owned the patents, the brands, the technology, and the customer relationships. And so China came up with a long-term strategy. First, we'll learn how to make it. But then we'll learn to improve it. And then we'll learn to design it. And finally, we'll own it.
大家好，这里是华人看世界 CNView 频道。40年前，中国和印度站在几乎相同的起点，人口超过10亿，农村人口庞大，贫困普遍，劳动力充足，两国都渴望通过经济转型改变命运。可几十年后，中国成为全球第2大经济体，数亿人摆脱贫困。印度虽然在科技、软件和服务业取得了巨大成就，却走出了另一条道路。究竟是什么造成了这样的差距？中国为何把制造业视为带领普通人走向中产的桥梁？又如何通过工厂培养工程师、管理者和企业家，最终从世界工厂走向产业链高端？而印度优先发展精英人才和全球后台服务的选择，又带来了什么结果？更重要的是，今天正站在相似十字路口的非洲，能从中吸取怎样的教训？面对青年就业、工业化和人工智能带来的挑战，非洲究竟该先追求创新，还是先创造能够吸纳数亿人的产业？接下来，我们将深度拆解中国与印度的发展路径，并一起思考非洲能否迎来真正属于自己的世纪。
Economic growth was too slow. Poverty was everywhere. Hundreds of millions of people were still working on small farms, producing barely enough to survive. Sounds familiar? Both governments understood that something had to change. Both wanted to industrialize. Both wanted to compete with the West. Both wanted to lift their people into the middle class. But then, and here's where I really need you to pay attention, they asked two completely different questions. And that matters because the question you ask determines the solution that you build. You ask the wrong question, and you can spend decades solving the wrong problem. Ask the right question, and you can change the course of history. China asked, how do we create jobs for hundreds of millions of ordinary people? India asked, how do we build a globally competitive economy? Now, at first, those may sound identical, but they're actually two very different missions. Because if your first priority is creating jobs, you build one kind of economy, right? But if your first priority is becoming globally competitive, you build another. Now, that single difference would shape the destiny of more than 2 billion people. You see, China's leaders looked at their country and saw something that many people viewed as a weakness. Nearly 80% of the population lived in rural areas, which is really, truly remarkable when you look at where China is today. Most people had limited formal education. Millions were leaving farms in search of opportunity. To many countries, that would have looked like a crisis. But China looked at it and saw its greatest competitive advantage. It had the largest untapped workforce on earth. And so instead of asking, what industry will make us the richest? China asked a different question. What industry can employ the most people? And my people, that question, that very specific question, changed history. Because China wasn't trying to create a few thousand high-paying jobs. It was trying to create hundreds of millions of jobs. And there was only one proven way to do that: manufacturing. Not because factories were glamorous, not because factory work was the end goal, but because factories were the fastest bridge between rural poverty in the middle class. And so that was China's bet. And over the next 4 decades, that would transform not just China's economy, but truly the global economy itself. But here's what most people still don't understand. China didn't become rich because it built factories. China became rich because it understood what factories actually produce. And it wasn't just products. It was something far more valuable. People. Think about how most people see a factory, right? They see a building, they see machines, they see, assembly lines, workers making shoes, toys, electronics, or clothing. But China saw something completely different. It saw a human development machine. You see, every person who walks into a factory enters with one set of skills and walks out with another. A farmer becomes a machine operator. A machine operator becomes a supervisor. A supervisor learns quality control, inventory management, logistics, and production planning. Some eventually leave to start their own businesses, yeah. Others become engineers, plant managers, or executives. The factory doesn't just manufacture products. It manufactures people. It manufactures skills, discipline, technical knowledge, problem solving, management, entrepreneurship. That's why manufacturing has played such a critical role in the rise of nearly every wealthy nation in modern history. Factories create something that economists call an industrial ecosystem. Because a factory never stands alone. Now, if you're building cars, someone has to produce the steel. Someone has to manufacture the glass. Someone has to make the tires. Someone has to transport the parts. Someone has to finance the equipment. Someone has to insure the business. Someone has to build the roads, ports, warehouses, and power plants that keep it running. You see, one factory creates hundreds of other businesses around it, thousands of jobs, entire cities. That's exactly what happened in China. Cities that were once small fishing villages became global manufacturing hubs. Companies that started by assembling simple products gradually learned to manufacture more sophisticated ones. And then they began designing them. And then they began innovating. And eventually, they began competing with the very countries that they had once learned from. This is one of the biggest misconceptions about China's rise. China didn't just wake up one day and decide to become a tech superpower. No. It earned its way there. Yeah. It climbed the industrial ladder one step at a time, patiently. It started with low-cost manufacturing, then moved into higher value manufacturing, and then advanced engineering, then robotics, and then electric vehicles, and now artificial intelligence. The factory wasn't the finish line, you see. It was the classroom. And that's the lesson that I think Africa and frankly much of the developing world often overlooks. Because today, everyone wants to build the next, Google and the next OpenAI, the next unicorn. But China understood something much more fundamental. Before you can build world-class technology companies, you have to build world-class people. Yes. And for China, the factory was where that transformation began. But here's the part of the story that almost everyone gets wrong. China's goal was never to become the world's factory. That was just the first chapter. The real goal was something much bigger. It was to become the world's owner. You see, in the beginning, China was mostly making products for other people's companies. An American company designed the product. A European company owned the brand. A Japanese company supplied the technology. And China simply assembled it. And China's leaders understood something very important. The biggest profits weren't being made on the factory floor. They were being made by the people who owned the patents, the brands, the technology, and the customer relationships. And so China came up with a long-term strategy. First, we'll learn how to make it. But then we'll learn to improve it. And then we'll learn to design it. And finally, we'll own it. Now think about the companies that dominate China today. Huawei, BYD, DJI, CATL, they didn't appear overnight. They are the result of decades of climbing the value chain. And this, my people, is where China's strategy becomes absolutely brilliant. China understood that if you want to become the world's leading innovator, you first have to learn from the world's leading innovators. And so in the early years, China welcomed Western companies with open arms. Yeah, you want us to assemble your smartphones? We'll do it. You want us to manufacture your computers? We'll do it. You want us to build your electronics, your appliances, your machinery, anything? We'll do it. But there was a condition. Teach us how. In order to do it, you got to teach us how. Not necessarily by handing over every trade secret, but by bringing production, engineering, management systems, supplier relationships, and manufacturing expertise into China. Because once production moved to China, something else moved with it: knowledge. Chinese engineers worked alongside some of the best engineers in the world, period. Chinese managers learned how global supply chains operated. Chinese suppliers learned how to meet the world's highest quality standards. Chinese companies saw how products were designed, tested, manufactured, and delivered at global scale. So they weren't just building products, they were building capabilities. And that's something many Western companies underestimated. They believed that they were simply lowering production costs, But China saw it as the greatest industrial classroom in modern history. Year after year, project after project, factory after factory, the knowledge accumulated, the experience accumulated, the confidence accumulated. Eventually, Chinese companies just stopped asking, how do we build this for someone else? And started asking, why don't we build this for ourselves? And that's when the real transformation began. They moved from assembling products to improving products, and from improving products to designing products, and then from designing products to creating global brands of their own. And today, many of the companies that once manufactured for Western firms are now competing directly against them. Fascinating. Now, I do want to make one important point, right? This wasn't simply a matter of Western companies handing over their intellectual property. Much of what China gained actually came through decades of joint ventures, supplier relationships, hiring experienced engineers, reverse engineering, domestic R&D, research and development, and learning by doing.
回看中国与印度过去几十年的发展道路，我们真正需要记住的，或许并不是谁赢了，谁输了，而是一个国家在面对自身现实的时候，究竟提出了什么问题，又选择用什么方式回答这个问题。中国首先面对的是数以亿计的普通人，是庞大的农村人口，是大量缺乏正式教育却渴望改变命运的劳动者。因此，中国把创造就业放在了经济转型的核心位置。制造业之所以重要，并不只是因为它能够生产商品、扩大出口，更因为它为普通人提供了进入现代经济的第一块踏板。一个农民走进工厂，带出来的可能不只是工资，还有操作设备的能力、遵守流程的习惯、理解质量标准的经验，以及与他人协作、解决问题管理团队的本领。有人从工人变成主管，有人进入工程岗位，有人积累经验后创办企业。工厂生产的表面上是产品，深层次上却是在培养人。在积累一个国家最重要的能力，这也是中国道路最值得复盘的地方。它没有把低成本制造当成最终目标，而是把制造业当成一所巨大的学校。从代工组装开始，学习生产、管理、工程和供应链，从模仿改进开始，逐步走向自主设计、自主研发和自主品牌。今天中国在电动汽车、机器人、通信设备以及人工智能等领域取得的进展，并不是突然发生的奇迹，而是多年积累之后，沿着产业链不断向上攀登的结果。与此同时，中国也让教育、产业和就业形成了相互配合的关系。经济需要什么样的人才，学校和职业教育就努力培养什么样的技能。发展汽车产业就培养相关技术人员， 建设交通网络就培养工程师和维修人才；推进先进制造就扩大应用科学和技术教育。教育不再只是等待经济提出需求，而是提前为未来的产业布局准备人力资本。印度的道路则呈现出另一种可能，它在软件、信息技术、金融服务、制药和工程咨询等领域培养出了世界级人才，也建立了具有全球竞争力的企业。这样的模式能够创造巨大财富，吸引国际资本，并让一批高技能人才迅速进入全球价值链的高端位置。但问题在于，一个软件工程师可以创造极高的经济价值，却未必能够吸纳数以千计、数以万计的普通劳动者。当一个国家拥有庞大的低技能人口时，少数精英产业的成功并不一定能够转化为广泛而快速的就业。这不是说服务业和科技产业不重要，而是说明一个国家必须分清财富增长与就业扩张之间的差别，也必须思考如何让更多人拥有攀登经济阶梯的第一级台阶。因此，印度和中国的经验不能被简单复制，更不能被粗暴地概括成一种模式绝对正确，另一种模式一无是处。印度证明了人才、教育和服务业可以打开全球市场，中国则证明了制造业能够吸纳广大人口，并在生产过程中持续培养能力。真正值得非洲借鉴的，不是照搬任何一个国家，而是根据自身人口结构、资源条件和发展阶段，找到最适合自己的组合。非洲今天最宝贵的资源，可能并不是石油、黄金或关键矿产，而是这里的人，尤其是正在成长的年轻人。未来几十年，世界上越来越多的年轻劳动力将来自非洲，这既是巨大的机会，也是极其严峻的考验。因为年轻人口只有在获得教育、技能和有尊严的工作之后，才能真正转化为发展动力。否则，人口增长就可能变成就业压力、社会焦虑和政治不稳定的来源。所以，非洲需要重新审视自己的发展目标，成为下一个人工智能中心、金融科技中心或者独角兽企业聚集地，当然令人期待。但这些目标不能取代更基础、更迫切的问题：什么产业能够为数百万、数千万普通人提供工作？什么样的工作能够让他们在获得收入的同时，也积累技能、经验和创业能力？什么样的投资能够在项目结束之后，仍然把技术、管理体系、供应商网络和本土人才留在非洲？这正是经济活动与经济转型的区别。经济活动可能只是带来一笔交易、一座厂房或一批出口订单，经济转型则会留下能够被本地企业继续使用的能力。外资进入当然重要，但更重要的是，非洲能否通过合作学会制造、改进和设计，能否建立自己的供应链，能否从资源出口者逐步变成产品制造者、技术开发者和品牌拥有者。人工智能的到来又让这一问题更加紧迫。未来许多重复性岗位可能被自动化，全球就业竞争不会因此变得轻松，反而可能更加激烈。非洲不能把希望寄托在某一种技术上，也不能认为只要建立几个科技园区就能解决整个大陆的就业问题。真正有效的战略应该是用今天的产业培养明天的人才，用制造业、农业加工、基础设施、能源和数字服务彼此连接，形成能够持续升级的产业体系。一个国家是否崛起，不能只看国内生产总值增长了多少，也不能只看吸引了多少外国投资，更要看这些增长创造了什么样的工作，培养了什么样的人，留下了什么样的能力。能够持续造血的经济才是真正有韧性的经济，能够让普通人参与其中的增长才是有社会基础的增长。中国和印度回答了各自时代的问题，现在轮到非洲回答自己的时代命题。非洲要走的未必是中国的路，也未必是印度的路，但必须是一条能够把人口优势转化为生产力，把投资转化为能力，把今天的就业转化为明天创新基础的道路。接下来最值得讨论的不是非洲能不能崛起，而是这种崛起将惠及多少人，又会留下什么。你认为非洲当前最应该优先发展的产业是什么？是制造业、农业加工、能源、基础设施，还是数字技术与人工智能？如果由你向非洲各国领导人提出一项建议，你会把重点放在职业教育、产业政策、区域贸易，还是本土企业的成长上？欢迎把你的判断和具体方案写在评论区，也欢迎把这期内容分享给更多关心非洲未来、全球发展与普通人命运的朋友。感谢收看，我们下期继续深度思考，别忘了点赞订阅，查看更多精彩视频。